Hi, I'm Casey. I've done a whole bunch of videos here on YouTube about applying for PhD programs. And throughout them, you will find things interspersed about letters of recommendation, who to ask and how to ask, etc. So in this video, I am streamlining all of that information into one video with my general advice about letters of recommendation, specifically for PhD programs. Some of this might apply more generally to letters of recommendation as well, at least the kind that tend to be written by professors. I'm going to be assuming that at this point, there's already a set of people that you can choose from to write your letters of recommendation. If you are early enough in the process, if you still have some time before you're going to be getting your applications together, it is possible that you could still get to know someone new well enough that they could write you a letter. If you're in that position, both this video and the one about setting yourself up well might have some tips for things that you could do to have more options for letter writers. But for this video, I'm just going to assume that you have some people to choose from and hopefully help you choose the best ones. So in general, the purpose of letters of recommendation is to get a qualitative sense of your potential for graduate school. There are a lot of things that can speak to that potential: your academic ability, your leadership ability, and perhaps most importantly, your potential as a researcher. How these things are weighed might depend a bit on the discipline. In my video about setting yourself up well, I mentioned how important it is to get to know faculty, and this is one of the reasons why. Letters of recommendation do not have to all come from professors, but I would say that the majority of letters probably should, if that's possible. It's also possible that you're in a somewhat unique position where there are other people who can speak better to your research capabilities than faculty. Like, let's say that you are working in industry in a research-heavy position. That might actually be the case. Though even in that case, it would be good to have at least one faculty member, for example, from an undergraduate degree or a prior graduate degree, if that's possible. All of this said, I want to make it clear that everyone's individual situation is quite unique. So I'm going to give you some general principles, but definitely don't see any of this as a deal breaker or something that you have to do. A PhD applicant who is coming straight out of an undergrad degree in the exact same discipline in which they're applying to PhD programs is in a very different position than someone who has been in the workforce for a decade or two. Neither one of those is better or worse than another just based on that situation, but it does make letters of recommendation slightly different. The first thing you should do is sit down and brainstorm a list of the people that you think could potentially speak to your potential as an academic, as a researcher. The best possible letter would come from a faculty member who has direct knowledge of your research abilities. This might be the PI of a lab that you worked in. This might be the advisor for an honors thesis. Or it might even be the instructor of a class where you wrote an amazing paper or did an amazing group project. This could also be someone that you've worked with or for in a job, an internship, something that is related to your discipline ideally. So these are the best letters of recommendation, but also people who can speak to your academic potential. These could be instructors of classes that you've taken where they will remember you well. Perhaps you were a strong participant in class discussions. Perhaps you wrote amazing reflections on readings. You might want to consider smaller classes that you've taken because it's more likely that the instructor remembers you, or faculty who you've had interactions with for other reasons, being the advisor of a club, an organization, etc. Another type of recommendation that can be useful is someone who can speak to your leadership ability, your work ethic, your creativity. These could be employers, for example, or again, people that you've worked with or for. Maybe you've had some experience working with a nonprofit or for a community organization. Maybe there's someone who can speak to a skill set that's within your discipline. This is actually quite difficult to talk about in generalities because these kinds of things are so unique. I have seen letters of recommendation from community organizers, people who work for nonprofit organizations or advocacy organizations, from lots of different kinds of employers, and of course, a large number from professors. There really could be so many possibilities here. But let me talk about a couple of things that are not great reasons to choose a letter writer. One thing you might wonder is, how important is the name? Does it make a difference if my letter writer is like the luminary in my field, the person who wrote the textbook for this discipline and everyone knows their name? Now, if that person falls into those other categories, awesome, they would be a great person to ask then. But I would not ask someone because of their name over someone who knows you well and can write a stronger letter. I have seen letters of recommendation come through that are from a name, where the letter literally just says, this student was in my class, here is what the class is about, this student got an A in my class. A letter of recommendation that just says they got an A in a class is not useful. That's on your transcript. We know you got an A in the class. And as I said in my video about setting yourself up well and getting to know faculty, an instructor in particular for a very large class, they need to be able to have some specifics, whether it's about work that you did in that class or how you participated. And it's very likely that you'll have at least one letter that is entirely based on your performance in a class. You're probably not going to have 3 faculty members with whom you did research to write you letters. And so it's totally fine to have a letter that speaks to your academic performance and potential, but just make sure that it's from an instructor who actually has something to say about you. And a letter from an instructor who is glowing and can really have super awesome things to say about your performance, even if no one has ever heard of them, that's better than a lackluster letter from a name. That said, all being equal, go with a name. But it's usually not equal. A question I often get is how to approach people to ask them to write you letters of recommendation. And I totally get why this can be kind of scary. But once you've made a decision about the best people to approach to write you letters, here's my recommendation. First of all, make sure that you give them plenty of time. I would say ask about a month before the deadline, maybe even 2 months if you have your ducks in a row that early. You should never ask someone just a few days before a deadline. Now, sometimes these things happen in part because maybe a letter writer ghosts you and you need someone to come in and pinch hit. But if you can avoid it, try to give them as much lead time as possible. Again, about a month is great. 2 weeks could be okay too, particularly if it's someone that you know pretty well. And if it's someone that you know pretty well, this probably won't be a tricky thing to ask them. You might have even already asked their advice about applying to graduate school, in which case they're expecting this. If it's someone that you don't know as well, or that you haven't seen in a while, let's say that you graduated from college 5 or 10 years ago, but you did have a professor that you are pretty confident you made an impression on. It is entirely possible that they don't remember you, but it doesn't hurt to ask. Regardless of whether you're in that position or whether it's a professor you took a class from a year ago, if it's someone that you haven't talked to in a while, my suggestion for how to reach out is this. Email them and say, I have decided to apply for PhD programs. And then tell them how your experience with them influenced this decision. Let's say it's an instructor that you took a class with. Your class on X was so interesting to me and influenced my research interests, or just made you more interested in doing research and being an academic. For any faculty, you can probably say something like that. This is good because A, it reminds them who you are because you're telling them what class you took with them, etc. B, it's a little bit flattering. It's kind of nice to hear that maybe something about someone's experience with you encouraged them to pursue higher education. And if it's someone who might not be familiar with what you've been doing lately, you should provide a bit more information about that. Perhaps attach a CV or a resume to this email, and then ask them if they would be willing to write you a strong letter of recommendation. I do suggest using that adjective. My hope is that most people would not consider writing a bad letter of recommendation. So that probably goes without saying. But you also want someone to feel free to tell you if they think they don't have much to say. I have done this before. If a student, for example, who took my class asked me to write a letter of recommendation, and maybe I don't remember them very well, usually what I'll do is look up their work from that class. But if all I think I can say is, here's the grade that the student got in my class, they did X kind of work, I'll write them back and say, if you need me to, I'd be happy to write you a letter, but just be aware that there's probably not a lot I can say beyond your general performance in this class. So if there are people that you think know you better, you might want to ask them instead. And if you say, can you write me a strong letter, someone might feel a little bit more comfortable telling you that. If it's someone outside of academia, you might need to provide a little more context about what it is that you're doing, what does it mean that you're applying to a PhD program, what kinds of things might they say about you. For example, I was really hoping that you could write a letter that speaks to my work ethic and leadership abilities, or something like that. If they agree to write you a letter, I recommend sending them, as soon as you have it, a copy of your statement of purpose. It's also incredibly useful as a letter writer to know more about the context of what kind of work this person wants to do, why they want to get a PhD, etc. And it's actually quite common for letter writers to sprinkle things into their letters that they get from the applicant themselves. Another really important tip with letter writers is to stay organized. If you are applying to a lot of schools, I recommend at the very least sending them a list with deadlines. You may even consider keeping a shared spreadsheet that you can send to all of your letter writers that has the programs, the deadlines, and maybe even a place for them to indicate when they've sent a letter. This could potentially be overkill, especially if you're only applying to a few programs. I did this when I was on the job market because I applied to 20 or 25 jobs, and it was a lot to keep track of, and I found this really helpful, and I think my letter writers did as well. Typically, the way that PhD applications work for letters is that when you submit your application, you will provide an email address for your letter writers, and then some automated system will send them an email telling them to upload their letter. Sometimes they're given a specific deadline for this. Sometimes the idea is just that it's supposed to be as soon as possible, so you may want to give them the deadline of whenever the actual applications are due. It is, of course, completely normal to be anxious about your letter writers getting their letters in on time. I do recommend keeping track of it, and you may want to send periodic reminders, but keep in mind that particularly very busy professors often tend to do things at the last minute. So it actually would not be strange at all for a professor to not send in their letter until the deadline. If you're very anxious, you could ask a few days before just to verify that they got the request and that they're planning to submit by the deadline. But don't panic if they haven't yet. And finally, the last thing that I'll add is that particularly for letter writers that you know very well, you could potentially ask them to mention things that you think it might be important for admissions committees to know, but that you might not want to mention yourself, or that might not be appropriate for a statement of purpose. One example might be if you went through something very difficult that might have influenced your grades. If they're familiar with this situation, it can sometimes be a nice thing to come from a letter writer as opposed to you. These things can often be framed positively to speak to your perseverance, for example. This isn't always appropriate and isn't always something that a letter writer might want to do, but I just want to mention it as something that is a possibility. So to summarize, choose letter writers that can speak best to your potential as a graduate student. Ask them with plenty of lead time, including telling them why you are asking them and why you're excited about a PhD. Make sure that you give them a copy of your statement of purpose, and make sure that you stay organized and help your letter writers as much as you possibly can in terms of making sure that they know exactly where they're going to have to send letters and what the deadlines are. All right, well, I hope that that was helpful. If you're going through this process yourself, good luck. And if you haven't checked out my other videos on this topic, you might find them helpful. Feel free to ask questions in the comments down below, and I will answer them as best that I can. And I'm Casey. Thanks for watching.